Hey, good afternoon, everybody. Today, I wanted to do a segment on something that so many people find contentious. In fact, it's nothing short of insane that this topic has caused some of those I most love and respect in the occult world to either unfriend me or simply mute me because they don't want to appear to be associated with somebody who's perceived as betraying the pagan world. So, why do I refuse to call myself a pagan? Why do I insist that authentic, traditional Italian witchcraft has nothing whatsoever to do with paganism or modern day pop culture witchcraft? Well, we're going to talk about that when we get back. Alchemy. And we are back. It's your favorite Italian witch and mystic, John Michael Salvato, Daddy Warlock to some of you. And I'm really excited to have the opportunity to tackle today's topic in this issue, this edition of Inner Alchemy. And before we jump through or into the topic, let's just take a minute to recognize that it really does help, and I really do appreciate helps keep the lights on when you like and subscribe, and on YouTube, click the notification bell so that you never miss another video. But more importantly, it really is something that I appreciate when you share these videos with those that you think might vibe with what we're doing. So thank you in advance for that. So let's go ahead and dive in and move through this topic. You know, why do I refuse to call myself a pagan? Why do I insist that Italian witchcraft, traditional Italian witchcraft, has nothing whatsoever to do with paganism or modern day pop culture witchcraft? And so this is a topic that you know, I encourage you guys as you're watching to join the conversation, and you can do that. I'll try to keep an eye on. Actually, I'll have to put my glasses on to do that. So let me go ahead and do that right off the bat, and I can go ahead and get my my thing off here so that I can post your comments on the page. And hello, Hearn, and hello, Crystalline. It's good to see you guys too. That's why I should have my glasses on. Let me just start off by saying that I don't intend to waste your time or mine on this video addressing the kinds of ignorance and pretentiousness that I've seen on other channels. So no matter how good you think that affected accent or eyeliner or glamour that you imagine to be throwing might be, the simple fact is that we do know the history of the ancient, unnamed, and unseen craft in Italy and Etruria especially. What is true is you might not know that tradition. You might not know the truth or the facts. And your traditional craft mythology might say otherwise, but it really is this simple. Italian practitioners of the craft know the history of our traditions, which were largely, if not exclusively, hereditary traditions passed down from generation to generation. And no, we don't always talk about everything that we know. We don't talk about everything that we do in our practice, especially with outsiders, and especially with pretentious queens on YouTube who might misrepresent the history of the craft or say stupid and disgraceful, patently false bullshit, like claiming that anyone who doesn't worship this goddess or that god, or who hasn't been initiated into your particular coven tradition aren't real witches. Girl, let me just tell you, I'd worry more about toning the bleach down and perfecting that British accent than I would on who is or isn't a real witch, okay? So let's move on and put the bitchiness aside. Let's really look at the problem. The problem that exists in so many pagan circles today is one of disconnection from historical fact. So we've got a comment here right off the bat. Hey, Mike, it's good to see you, my brother. Old Italian witchcraft is more based on Catholicism. They use the saints a lot. Actually, we're talking about that, and that is true about the modern Italian witchcraft. We're talking about traditional Italian witchcraft, which has nothing whatsoever to do with Catholicism, predates that by a couple thousand years, and is the tradition that I was raised in. But the tradition that Mike's talking about is called Benedicaria in the modern lingo, and really is based on the use of saints as spirits in their spell work. And that would be the tradition that a lot of our grandparents would have grown up in. So absolutely, that's a topic for another show, and maybe we'll have you on, Mike, so we could talk about that, because that is because Catholic conjure, as it's known in the secular world, is a real thing. But see, the problem, like I said, I think the problem that exists in today's pagan circles is one of disconnection from history, one of disconnection from fact and reality. And the facts are that there are almost no pagans alive today outside of Africa and India, and some small communities in Greece and Cyprus. What we have today are neo-pagans. And those neo-pagans are often, I hate to say it, but they're often delusional when it comes to their imaginary connections to the traditions of antiquity. And that's unfortunate. You know, it's I think it comes from needing to validate ourselves and not being comfortable enough in our practice. A classic example would be those who practice neo-pagan religions like Wicca, or the imaginary Italian-American tradition of Svegaria, which doesn't exist anywhere in Italy, and no authentic Italians would ever say that they practice such a thing. Most practitioners of the Gardnerian and Alexandrian derived traditions would all come under this umbrella. And without exception, these are all 20th century modern interpretations of witchcraft and religion that were derived entirely from two sources. So let's start there. Let's start with an understanding. First, those traditions that I just mentioned are wholly based on the mistaken notion that what folklorist Charles Leland witnessed in Tuscany in the early 20th century had anything even remotely to do with witchcraft. And we're going to unpack why that's a foolish, flawed, and erroneous supposition in a couple minutes. But second, those 20th century traditions are also very, very heavily influenced by 17th, 18th, and 19th century esotericism, mystery school traditions, secret societies, none of which had anything to do with actual witchcraft either. So let's go ahead and start with Charles Leland. Now, those who know me know I love Charles Leland. He was a brilliant folklorist, to be sure. As somebody who's got a doctorate in theological anthropology, his work is something that I truly and very highly appreciate. But his observations of various magical traditions were themselves deeply flawed. And again, that is a topic for another show entirely, but it needs to be said. So we're going to start with something that even the most rabid of neo-pagans can agree with us on, and that is that Charles Leland was not Italian, and he was not a practitioner of witchcraft. So I think we can all agree on that. He was a linguist, he was a humorist, he was a folklorist, was actually from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, from my stomping grounds and home. So when a non-Italian outsider, whom we as Italians refer to as a Medigani, asks about a tradition that has been privately held, even secretive in many respects, for generations, in my family allegedly for 3,000 years, although I can only find concrete evidence that there's 1,900 or so years of personal practice. You can be sure of one thing. Within our own family, there are people who are not initiated into our practice who know nothing about the practice. So an outsider is certainly not going to know. And so for Charles Leland in Tuscany, that American is not going to be let in to learn the things that they would be incapable of understanding from a cultural perspective, let alone from a magical perspective. So the legend tells us that a witch by the name of Maddalena gave Leland a manuscript, and that manuscript was to a document alleged to be the Vangelo, the Gospel of the Witches. And it's a wonderful tale. It's a romantic tale. It's beautiful. and fun, and a story of how the goddess Diana supposedly fucked her brother Lucifer and gave birth to the first witch, Aradia. But there's a problem there. See, the actual story would have never been told using Roman deities' names, first of all. And major parts of that story are missing. And they're missing for good reason. They're missing intentionally. Second, Maddalena was alleged to have invited Leland to attend a meeting of or a gathering of the Boschetto in Tuscania. And a Boschetto, for those who aren't familiar, is a coven or a grove. It's a religious gathering. And if I had the ability to do two things at once, I would make sure that on the screen underneath here, it said in bold letters, a religious gathering, which has absolutely nothing to do with the practice of witchcraft. It's a religious gathering, period. It would have been a gathering of members of a particular Dianic cult, most likely, which we could be sure had nothing to do with the original Dianic worship cults. So there wasn't even antiquity in terms of the religion that was being practiced there, because a male would have never been included or invited, particularly an outsider, to the original Dianic cults. But in around the time there was a consensus that there were Dianic cults that had both male and female. And Crystalline, I see a question from you. I thought Diana's brother was Apollo. Because you're Greek. We're not talking about Greek mythology. We're talking about a mythology that predates the Greek mythology by hundreds, if not 1,000 years. And Diana's brother was Lucifer. But the name that would have been used would have been, even in the older text, wouldn't have even been Diana and Lucifer. It would have been Uni and Tinia, or Tana and Tanus. So that was my point, in telling that story. But yes, in the Greek mythology, which we're not talking about, that would have been the equivalent names. So back to my point. This was likely a reconstructionist cult, as we call it, of worshipers of the old goddess and the god. And how do I know? Well, in the simplest of terms, because members of my family, going back generations and generations, including me, have at various times been part of that old religion. And anybody who grew up in the East Coast of the United States can tell you some of the old timers had statues of Diana, had statues of Athena, had certain things that they did, certain things, and they never really explained why. So I can tell you without equivocation that the religious gathering that Charles Leland saw had nothing to do with witchcraft. It was a religious gathering. Now, there was a tangential belief that the uninitiated, and that's really important to understand, that the uninitiated might have believed that the person of Aradia in the cult's ancient mythos was the first witch. But that is, again, coming from somebody who wasn't initiated, who didn't understand our culture. And so, again, Crystalline says, okay, is it a different Lucifer than the Christian Lucifer? Yes, it is a completely different Lucifer. Lucifer in the Christian context is actually, in the Christian Bible, is a reference to Jesus of Nazareth. It is not, as many people misunderstand and misrepresent. Lucifer doesn't refer to a fallen angel in the scripture. It doesn't refer to a devil or anything like that. Lucifer, in his original form as the morning star, was the brother of Diana. And again, this is not a discussion of Greek mythology or Roman mythology or Etruscan mythology. So I want to stay I want to stay focused because I don't want people to get confused, because I think this message is really important. So again, back to what we were talking about. I don't believe Charles Leland really understood what he was witnessing. And clearly, I think that he was influenced in his interpretation because of the time that Leland was in Tuscany. I would assume that he was influenced by the lies and the machinations of the Roman and Anglican churches, who, as Crystalline and I were just speaking about, was often guilty of conflating who some of these characters were. You know, Lucifer, as Andrea says, was a title with gods, and it meant bearer of light. And again, that's true, but this is not a course on comparative religions. This is a broadcast in which we're talking about a very specific topic. And so in this very specific topic, Charles Leland, and guys, like, let's focus for a minute. Charles Leland went to Tuscany and he heard a story about Diana and her brother Lucifer, period. I don't care what any other religion, what any world mythology has to say about this. Let's talk about what we're talking about and why he misinterpreted it. So he would have he would be filtering what he was seeing through the lens of Roman Catholic and Anglican churches, who conflated these religious gatherings as being gatherings of witches. So it wasn't that anybody there told him he saw a gathering of witches. It's that he conflated that because he saw a coven in the worship of Diana and Lucifer and misinterpreted that as being a gathering of witches. And so decades later, when people like Alex Sanders and Gerald Gardner would create entire systems, magical systems and religious traditions upon that series of Leland's misinterpretations, what would happen is that those misrepresentations would influence what they created. And so I think there isn't really time to get into a debate on the apparent stretching of the truth that people like Gardner and Sanders and Grimassi were caught in at various times in their careers when it came to the apparently non-existent covens that each one of them claimed to have been initiated into before creating their own branch of witchcraft. We get it. People like backstories, and modern paganism is a religion. And like most religions throughout history, in fact, based on my observations as an anthropologist, like all religions, religions are based on myths. They're based on legends. They're based on folklore and tales that are passed on, oral tradition for the most part. So if modern witchcraft has no roots in antiquity and Leland's origin story is frankly bullshit, does that mean we should disregard it? And that's where I think the contention comes up. You see, the modern practitioners of neo-pagan witchcraft feel like they have to defend their craft because somebody pointed out flaws in their origin story. But I'm here to tell you today, modern witchcraft, paganism, neo-paganism, whatever you want to call it, is every bit as valid of a religious tradition as any other religious tradition, in my opinion. That neo-pagans promote a fantastical tale of Diana and her brother, the great horned one, or Lucifer, kicking it and giving birth to a witch named Aradia, is no less believable, in my opinion, than the tale of Moses parting the Red Sea or the tale of the zombie Jesus coming back from the dead after 3 days in the grave. So religious stories are religious stories, and religions are based on fantasy, on mythos, and on midrash. The stories are designed to tell us, to give us a greater message. So the neo-pagan traditions are every bit as valid as any other religion, and neo-pagan witchcraft is every bit as valid as any other form of witchcraft. However, you knew there had to be a however. Witchcraft itself was never a religion in the ancient world. And in Italy and most of Eastern Europe, where the true forms of traditional witchcraft have existed and been practiced for millennia, witchcraft still isn't a religion. And it will never be a religion for those folks. But that doesn't mean that it's not a religion for neo-pagans. The real, authentic, traditional witchcraft is the product of cultural heritage, mystery traditions, occult understanding, and the practice of personal power. That's what the origins of the practice of witchcraft are. And while some would have you believe that we have no idea where the word witch or witche was first coined, and that's technically true, the anthropological and historical fact that escapes them is that we know that witchcraft in literally dozens of other languages has been referred to in writing for at least 3,700 years. I mean, we know that in 1754, 1755, before the Common Era. It's mentioned in the Code of Hammurabi. It's mentioned in the ancient Hebrew tradition, in the Babylonian and East Asian traditions. It can be found in Vedic texts and Balkan traditions. It's been part of the ancient animism of indigenous peoples from Africa and New Zealand, Pacifica, and the Americas for thousands of years. So it doesn't matter whether the word witchcraft was used, the practice of witchcraft is referred to in different languages. And no, somebody in South America wouldn't call it witchcraft. Somebody from Africa might not call it witchcraft. They would use their own language. So it's only in fact, it's only in the modern day that we do such pretentious, childish, and Dungeons and Dragon-esque nonsense as using old languages instead of using a living language. And so we say shit like blessed be and so mote it be and blah, blah, blah. We put our little pointy hats and shit on. You know, in the real world and outside of fantasy and Dungeons and Dragons, we speak the language of our current time in order to communicate most effectively. And so I would suggest that the first step toward ending the childish and frankly ignorant divisions that neo-pagans create when they exclude the voices of practitioners of older forms of witchcraft would be for all of us to understand that we need to find a language that works for everyone. And I see a comment here coming from Deanna. Deanna says, going back to when you were discussing initiations, are we initiated into our craft in the Italian tradition? And the answer to that is yes and no. So I want to come back to the point, but that's a good question. And our initiation in traditional witchcraft is an initiation that happens organically. It's an initiation that comes from a grandmother or an aunt or an uncle or a father or a mother working with the next generation and teaching them our ways. And so it's initiation. And then as Mike Adamo was saying a little bit earlier, as the tradition started to get blended with folk Catholicism and Benedicaria, what we would start to see are sort of initiatory traditions like Christmas Eve, after midnight mass, sitting down with your grandmother and learning how to do the molecular removal. So that in itself is a form of initiation of sorts. And so we could actually say that yes, initiation exists, but it's not the type of initiation that a lot of people imagine. It's not the kind of initiation you see in paganism, because that kind of initiation is a religious initiation, Deanna. So that's a religion, that's an initiation into a religious tradition, much like the mystery schools, much like secret societies. In fact, most of the initiatory rites of neo-pagan traditions are directly lifted from Masonry and some of the other mystery schools and secret societies. So yes, we do have initiation of a sort, but back to the original topic. I really think we have to find a language that works for everyone. And I'm sorry, my Parkinson's meds are on the verge of wearing off. I didn't look at the clock before we started. So I'd suggest we come from well, let's put it this way. For me, coming from an anthropological background, that we consider using the construct of what we would call classification language to help us better understand and better define traditions. So as a starting point, if we could define what it is that each of us practices, it might be easier to understand the common ground that exists and to celebrate the diversity that exists. For example, we could agree that 20th century traditions are examples of modern witchcraft, which itself is always evolving. Like when we say modern witchcraft, it's not something that Gardner and Sanders, or even in the 80s, Gramassi and his gang created and then it just stopped in time. It's always evolving. thought leaders and community sages within that community have stepped up, and especially in recent years, they've begun to really and truly bring some of the greatest insights and value to the discussion of modern witchcraft, I think, that we've seen in generations. And I think that's something that we should all be proud of. Even if we don't practice paganism, we should be proud that the conversation is happening, including this conversation, I think. So I would include in some of the older forms of 20th century or modern witchcraft, things like the Gardnerian and Alexandrian derivative practices, as well as newer traditions like Wiccan-derived practices and Grimasi's nearly defunct Stregoria. If we think like more in terms of like Laurie Cabot's vibrant tradition and the newer, more diverse paths, which seem to have drawn on Laurie Cabot's brilliant work. If we look at some of that and we say, look, here is a tradition that that kind of bridges and fleshes out the blending of religion and science and art into a modern practice that's neither 100% religion or 100% secular, then we begin to understand this practice, this corpus of practices, to be modern witchcraft or modern paganism. So if we can agree on that, and we can say, okay, so this is a term that we're all going to use, we're going to refer to modern witchcraft, and we're going to know what that means. That it means a practice of the craft that blends religion in with the ancient craft, and to varying degrees. For some, it may just be very tangential. To others, it may be more integrated and more integral a part of the practice. And then there are those of us on the other side who practice, whose paths predate the neo-pagan traditions, who predate Catholic conjure, who predate any of the religious traditions. This would include the African traditional practices and their derivative expressions in the diaspora, the Italian, the Balkan, the Romani, Persian, and Sicilian folk-magick, witchcraft, and other magical practices. Okay, so none of these by themselves are religion, but some of them, as Mike and I were talking earlier, can be practiced in conjunction with religion. Some of them are not practiced at all in conjunction with religion. But as people, anthropologically, it's a little bit difficult to tease out where or draw a distinction between where our practice ends and where our personal religious beliefs might begin. And so, as such, those practices, the Balkan and the Romani and Persian and Sicilian and Italian traditions, might have less in common with witchcraft, with postmodern or modern witchcraft, pop culture witchcraft, as I call it, than they do with we might have more in common with esotericism or the mystery schools or New Thought philosophy than we do with neo-pagan religious traditions. And so I would suggest that we would call what we do traditional witchcraft. Now these paths, because it isn't just one path of traditional witchcraft. Like I said, they're culturally derived. They're always evolving too, but they derive from a culture, and so they evolve more organically. So back to Deanna's question, when Deanna Marie said, do we have initiation? Yes, but our initiations are more organic, and so they aren't ritual in nature, and they aren't religious in nature. But here's the thing. Because I'm part of a magical tradition that predates Gardnerian or Alexandrian traditions by thousands of years, it doesn't mean that my tradition is better or more authentic or more valid than those traditions that were created in the 1940s or the 1980s or last Tuesday. And so that's something that I think is important too. I think, that without question, there are some neo-pagan practitioners, especially some of the younger ones, who get their horns twisted because they think that it's invalidating them. And you've got to understand, millennials as a whole grew up in a culture where everybody got a trophy. You didn't play Little League baseball and have the champions, and then the kids who lost, just went home and learned that next year I'll try harder. everybody got a trophy. They got participation trophies. And that's why I think so many of this younger generation gets their horns so twisted when they feel like the mythos that they bought into, some of which they made up, some of which they got from stupid movies on television or at the movie theater, when their participation trophy gets taken away from them. So these neo-pagans' reliance upon blending religion into their practice and the use of religious initiation and any of the other superstitions that those religious traditions involve, that doesn't make them any more valid or any more authentic or any more worthy of respect than the traditions like mine or other traditional witchcraft either. And so I would offer that both traditional witchcraft and modern witchcraft are equally becoming outdated. That's the conversation nobody wants to have. But the problem with moving toward a postmodern expression of witchcraft is that we have a lot of people, trying to think the nicest way to say this. There are a lot of completely clueless posers, wannabes, and bullshit merchants in the mix who have to first go away. And Ellie, I want to recognize and thank you. You just got my book and you're excited to start learning about your roots. That's awesome. We're going to talk about those roots in a little bit too. So what do we do? When we have these posers, we have these wannabe experts, who go out and publish a book, and all of a sudden they're like the end all be all scholar, instead of, by comparison to some of the modern witchcraft practitioners who are writing books that constantly evolve and constantly challenge us to think. I mean, I think about Matt Oren's book, Psychic Witch, which not only gives us good foundational material, but also says, hey, start doing some of the work on your own and start exploring on your own. So from alleged scholars who misrepresent cultures that they absolutely know nothing about, I'm thinking right now of a supposed scholar of Druidism who recently appeared on a couple podcasts where she totally and absolutely misrepresented a number of Balkan and Slavic traditions. To those who ride on their husbands' or wives' coattails, who think they're writing a book affecting a fake accent and then pretentiously claiming to invalidate those who are not part of their tiny fan club or as not being valid witches, and the now, of course, infamous manic meatball of Federal Street in New England, who promotes Trumpian racism and threatens to sick volcanoes on people. We need to rid our communities of these kinds of bad actors, or at the very least, call them out for their bullshit and lies and tell them to sit down, shut the fuck up, and allow somebody else to be part of the conversation. Only when we get rid of all those posers are we going to be able to gain from the wisdom of so many practitioners in both modern witchcraft and traditional witchcraft worlds to possibly discover a platform, a common ground on which real dialogue, real encouragement, and real magic can find its expression. So we've got a couple more comments here. From Mike, says, for me, it always just felt right to be living as a witch with Wicca. I knew I was a witch. It helped me find a set of values that weren't so old school and blending the religion and the craft. Yeah, see, so I mean, I don't understand why we can't just respect that for some people, structure is necessary. For some people, origin story and mythos is necessary. And for some people, they look for a way to blend religion and magic. And so that's where modern witchcraft is absolutely just as valid as those of us like myself for whom none of that matters, and for whom traditional witchcraft is an answer. It doesn't make Mike's magic any less valid or powerful or worthy of respect than mine, and vice versa. And there's no reason why we can't be in a position to celebrate that. I teach an authentic Italian and Afro-Sicilian traditional folk magic, mysticism, and witchcraft course. It's a year-long course, and we've recently opened it up from being closed, from being one of them. Looking for my banners here, so we can put that on the screen. we recently decided we wanted to open that up so that people who were not Italian, and people who were not part of the family could have access to the material and could actually learn about real Italian folk magic. It's a non-religious, anthropologically intact, historically and academically backed approach that might not be everybody's cup of tea. And so when I was setting that up, I said, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer everybody a sneak peek, a look behind the curtain, if you will, so that they can see if they vibe with me, they can see if this is the kind of course they're looking for. And in fact, I even offer to those who take the course an opportunity to get a copy of my book, Magic at the Crossroads, Italian Folk Magic and the Old Religion, a copy of that book for free, so that they have context and so that they can understand that I'm not telling anyone that this is the only way for these things to be done. I'm sharing with everybody the way that they're done in my tradition. And so I welcome the folks that seem to delight in abusing the bully pulpit on social media an opportunity to come on my show and discuss their snide little digs that are made at those of us who don't practice pagan religions. I've offered them the chance to have that conversation with us and for us to debate and for us to agree or disagree. And I've said that naturally, we're not gonna always agree on everything, but because these folks that are out there invalidating folks, gatekeeping, saying, oh, you're not really a witch if you don't get initiated, you're not really a witch if you don't follow one of the Gardnerian or Alexandrian or whatever traditions, naturally, because those folks like Donald Trump know that they would be ill-equipped to have an intelligent conversation with me, with somebody who has legitimate scholarship to back their opinions. Those folks have refused to appear on the show. No surprise, and it doesn't matter, because the future of the craft is not about me, it's not about them, it's about each and every one of us that are watching this right now and those who aren't watching it right now. It's a discussion that they can never silence. See, they can disinvite us from their conferences, they can exclude us from their discussion groups, but the conversation continues with or without the permission. Witchcraft doesn't need validation, it doesn't need permission, and it doesn't need approval, and neither do I. So I just wanted to put that out there to share that with you guys. A couple folks have asked me. I think it really comes down again to the concept of embracing a culture of compassion and diversity, saying that, yeah, there is modern witchcraft, and modern witchcraft blends religion and witchcraft. It was created, there isn't any Wiccan that tries to tell you that anything that they do has roots in the ancient world is lying to themselves and to the world around them. It's not necessary for you to create a fake origin story any more than it's necessary for practitioners of hereditary magic like me to pretend that somehow makes you more powerful or more skilled or better than anybody else. It just means that there were other practitioners in your family, period. And so I think that when we come to this place where we begin to have a conversation about finding a common language, about finding a way in which a better framework for us to be able to start the dialogue and begin to find common ground, I think that has to be compassion. I think that has to be a place of diversity and plurality that's missing in the world. And I think that we do no service to ourselves or to one another when we say, well, I'm not getting involved in political conversations. I'm not getting involved in controversial discussions. That just means that you're a coward, and it means that you don't really care enough about yourself or about others to want to leave this world a better place. And so I'm going to end today encouraging everybody to stay in the moment, because that's where the power is, to bring gratitude to that moment, because that opens the door to the abundance that's waiting for us. It really puts us in our power. But I'll leave you with a public service announcement from the Charter for Compassion, because I believe every word that they say in this little short clip, and I believe it's the path that we each need to take in the pagan community, in the traditional witchcraft community, in the religious community, in the secular community, and as a world.
The principle of compassion lies at the heart of all religious, ethical, and spiritual traditions,
calling us always to treat all others as we wish to be treated ourselves.
Compassion impels us to work tirelessly to alleviate the suffering of our fellow creatures.
To dethrone ourselves from the center of our world and put another there.
To honor the inviolable sanctity of every single human being.
Treating everybody without exception.
With absolute justice, equity, and respect.
It is also necessary in both public and private life.
To refrain consistently and empathically from inflicting pain.
To act or speak violently out of spite, chauvinism, or self-interest.
To impoverish, exploit, or deny basic rights to anybody.
And to incite hatred by denigrating others, even our enemies.
Is a denial of our common humanity.
We acknowledge that we have failed to live compassionately.
And that some have even increased the sum of human misery in the name of religion.
We therefore call upon all men and women to restore compassion
to the center of morality and religion.
To return to the ancient principle
that any interpretation of scripture
that breeds violence,
hatred, or disdain
is illegitimate.
To ensure that youth are given accurate and respectful information
about other traditions, religions, and cultures.
To encourage a positive appreciation of cultural
and religious diversity.
To cultivate
an informed empathy
with the suffering of all human beings,
even those
regarded as enemies.
We urgently need to make compassion a clear, luminous, and dynamic force in our polarized world.
Rooted in a principled determination to transcend selfishness.
Compassion can break down political, dogmatic, ideological, and religious boundaries.
Born of our deep interdependence, compassion is essential for human relationships and to a fulfilled humanity.
It is the path to enlightenment and indispensable in the creation of a just economy and a peaceful global community.